except my wife. The only one that matters. Okay. All right, we are on lesson 4 in our study tonight. And lesson 4 is titled, In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge. And we've been talking about the need for truth, and as we've moved through this series, moved through that section, we've concluded that there is truth, that we can know truth, and that it's important for us to know what the truth is so that we can apply that truth to our lives because ultimately it matters. And so let's begin here as we have been doing with some key terms. I always like these. Like I said, we're going to go through it. We're going to kind of define it. And then as we go through our lesson, we're going to kind of refer back to all of these. So some of these, this lesson is a little more scientific, maybe, than the last couple. But don't tune out. Be like, oh, this isn't for me. No, this is good. It's good stuff. Nothing is, I get it, which means it's not that complicated. And at the end, I feel that the conclusion of this comes back to Scripture, and we're going to talk about, as we sang about, how great our God is. And so follow with me. All right, first here, we have the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument. Yeah. That argument, it's the argument that states that because the universe had a beginning, it must have had a cause. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about causes and effects and causes and beginnings today. Second of all, we see the law of causality. The law of causality, which says that it's the scientific law that states that everything that had a beginning had a cause. Okay, this is something that no one here is curious about. Like, this is not something you're all like, well, is that true? Like, everything we know that we have ever seen has a cause. And the law of causality is a basis of like the scientific method. Like, all of science works because of this law, right? What is science? Science is a study, is a look to find the causes of stuff, right? Why is gravity? Oh, and what is gravity, right? So we define these things. And these things, we wouldn't be able to find them if we didn't believe in the law of causality. So this is what we call, as we've talked about in the last couple lessons, a first principle that is self-evident. It's self-evident. We know this. And we may jump back if we have time to this even in addition, but the law of causality. We have the second law of thermodynamics. Second law, you're like, oh, this is like high school all over again. And that is the scientific principle that the universe is running out of usable energy and that nature as a whole is moving toward disorder rather than order. All right? This idea of the second law of thermodynamics is that there is a fixed amount of energy in the universe and that the universe is running toward having no energy, not running toward having extra. Okay? We're not gaining. All right? Everything, there's only a certain amount that we're using up. All right? It's also the idea of moving toward disorder rather than order. In other words, if you clean your child's room and you leave it alone, over time it will gradually move towards disorder. It will never get more ordered. Right? This is the law of entropy. This is the second law of thermodynamics. The reason, as silly of an illustration as that is, that principle holds true in everything. If we were to very orderly take all of the molecules of something and put them in order and then let them go, over time they would become disordered. Okay, this is true on a molecular level, and it's true on a cosmic level, and it's true in our children's bedrooms. It's just true. The next is the first law of thermodynamics. This is the scientific principle that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. Okay? You might have heard it worded that energy, matter, is neither created nor destroyed. Okay? There it is. There it is. Just wave at me. I have it right in front of me, and it doesn't matter. I still don't see it. Anyways, all right. So that matter is neither created nor destroyed. In other words, when God created the universe, which obviously is my bias, when God created the universe, there was a fixed amount of energy in it, and we burn that energy, and that matter and energy is changed, but it doesn't ever go away, and nothing new comes to being. In other words, if I were to say to a person, I want you to create something, they can only use what exists here to create something new. If I say make a statue, they don't look and go, and a statue appears. They take dirt, right, or clay, and they make a statue. Why? Because nothing is created in addition, right? Something was created at one point. That's what we're going to look at today, but nothing is created now, okay? Everything in our universe is constant, okay? And these principles, these last three principles that we talked about, are scientifically proven, 100% agreed upon by everyone since Einstein, okay? There is no one in our scientific community that is any sort of serious scientist that would say that the second law of thermodynamics does not exist. They have proven that it exists, that it's true, that it's valid, and that's good. That's fine. We can do that. We can run with that. The next is the law of entropy. The law of entropy. This is the scientific law that states without intervention, things tend to dissolve from order to disorder. Okay, this is kind of like the second law of thermodynamics. This is an aspect of that law. Okay, and we talked about that, entropy. Okay, human beings, right? You start off nice and fresh when you're a baby, and you grow, and everything starts to run down, right? Nothing ever gets better. That's not the way that works. Next, we have cosmic background radiation. These are fancy. We're not going to talk about the Avengers or anything. Cosmic background radiation. This is remnant heat, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, so don't immediately turn me off here. Remnant heat from the Big Bang, okay? We're going to talk about this. In the form of microwave radiation that has been subsequently stretched and cooled as the universe expanded. Okay, we can see this. If you were to look out, we can see this stuff. They call it cosmic background radiation. Okay? Next, we have the Kalam cosmological argument. K-A-L-A-M. Kalam. Oh, there it is. Cosmological argument. Okay? Kalam. Kalam is an Arabic word, and it means like from the beginning, created, I believe. It's a philosophical argument. So the cosmological argument we're going to go over in depth, but that's a scientific argument. The Kalam cosmological argument is a philosophical argument for the beginning of time that states that because there cannot exist an infinite number of days before today, the universe must have had a beginning. Again, we're going to jump back into this, so don't be like, oh, I don't get any of this. We're going to go into each of these points today. This is what our lesson is. All right? I told Scott I studied a lot for this lesson. This lesson was intimidating to me. All right? So the Kalam cosmological argument. I believe that when we get through this lesson, you are going to stand in agreement with me, however, that the universe had a cause. From a logical, scientific perspective, the universe had a cause. All right? Albert Einstein, who was not Christian, okay? He was not Christian. At best, he was agnostic in some points of life, but he didn't particularly like religion. But he said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind, okay? And so we're going to talk about some of the science behind our religion today. We're going to kind of talk about some of that, all right? If you have science without religion, you can see why, what's happening as a description, but it doesn't have any point because there's no religion to it. Religion is the point, right? It's the worldview. It's the box top, as we talked about in the past couple of lessons. But religion without science is blind, and we don't want to have a blind faith any more than we want to have facts with no reason to have them, okay? So, why then is it important that we can know important to know all about the origin of the universe? And how will knowing how the universe came about change the way that we live now? You say, well, all these science things that you stated are scary and they're big words, and I didn't like it when I was in high school, and I don't like it now. We don't change that much, really. Well, it's important to know how the universe came into being, because if the universe is eternal, then with no intelligent cause, then we can live our lives according to our subjective desires and needs, okay? In other words, if the universe is eternal and nothing made us and we're just the subject of random chance, then I might as well just do whatever I can do to make myself happy. Because I'm just a small speck in an eternal universe. But if the universe was created by an intelligent being who has a plan for his creation, knowing whether or not there is a plan for our lives will change the decision we make, right? If God exists and he created the world, he created the universe, then there's a reason that he created me, because there was a reason he created the world and the universe. Either God created us or we created God. That really is the conclusion. There's only two options. We talked about the law of excluded middle last week, how we have one or the other. If we created God, then there's no ultimate meaning or purpose in life. There's no objective right and wrong. These are the conclusions we come to if we honestly step out into a materialistic worldview, that everything is natural, there's no supernatural, there is no God. The conclusion is then there's no objective right and wrong, and in the end, it doesn't matter how we live because we're all going to return to dust anyway. If there's no God, then we're completely on our own. But if God created us, then there's ultimate meaning and purpose to our lives because the Creator has put us here for a reason. And we're going to keep coming back to that principle because it's super, super important. Now, this week we're going to talk about the cosmological principle for the creation of the world. Next week, we're going to talk about the teleological principle. Again, big words. It's no big deal. Basically, we're going to talk about design next week. We're going to talk about the beginning this week. We're going to talk about design next week. I think 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, we're going to talk about morality. All right? And this idea of if God exists or if God doesn't exist, then there is no morality. There's no one to tell me what's right, what's wrong. And if no one's there to tell me what's right and what's wrong, then my opinion's as good as your opinion, and so I'm just going to go with my opinion, because why not? Why do I have to listen to you, right? So we're going to talk about that. So as much as I say that here, I'm going to kind of leave that here on that step, and we are going to come back to it in a couple weeks. All right. So we have the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The word cosmological comes from the Greek word cosmos, okay, meaning having to do with the universe, okay? Cosmology, the study of the universe. We're going to kind of start way out here. That's why we're saying how great thou art, because it's amazing when we think about the size of our universe. I read last night that there are but from us to the nearest star is like trillions of miles. Trillions of miles. We can't even fathom it. If you were to go as fast as our space station is going around the Earth in orbit, which is like 17,000 miles an hour, that's 5 miles per second. Okay, 5 miles per second. If you were to go that fast, it would take you over 200,000 years to get to the nearest star. That's how far apart it is. The Bible says, and scientists agree, that there are more stars than the number of sands on the sea, that God has named them all. And think about that. If it takes 200,000 years from us to get from here to the next one, and then it would take 200,000 to get from that one to that one, and God says he named them all. Yeah, that's right. We'd all be pretty old. I mean, maybe old age is just a number. So the last chapter taught us that the argument taught us that for an argument to be true, remember at the end of last lesson, it has to be logically sound. Okay, so we're going to make some logically sound arguments. That is, it's determined by deductive reasoning, and that its premises, the things we observe, must be true. That's inductive reasoning. So there are two key premises that make up the cosmological argument. First, premise one, that everything that had a beginning had a cause. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. And secondly, the second premise, the universe had a beginning. If everything that has a beginning has a cause, and the universe had a beginning, then we can conclude that the universe had a cause. Do you have a problem with your paper? Is it on the back? Okay, good. Oh, I have to print them double-sided because I put so many notes out. I understand. Therefore, the universe has a cause. All right, so we're going to look at this principle. The cosmological principle is simple. It's simple in its basic stating, right? Everything that had a beginning had a cause. Now, we believe this. We believe, as we said before, in the laws of causality. Scientists believe this. This is not something that they would deny. You wouldn't talk to a scientist and they would be like, well, I don't believe that the law, in the law of causality, that there's cause and effect in our universe. If they did say that, I would say, what caused you to think that way? Right? Because our thoughts are based on causes. Because everything that we have seen, that we have heard, that we have thought, is from a cause and effect. And so we know just by observation that principle one is true. So therefore, we can conclude that since things don't just pop into existence from nowhere, I'm not concerned that like a yellow hippopotamus is going to pop in over here and charge across the room. Why? Because there's no hippopotamus over there. It doesn't exist. And so since it doesn't exist, I don't have to worry about it. I was telling one of the things I was reading the other day said, it's funny, but people say all the time, like when they get into car accidents, like, man, that guy just came out of nowhere. And we know, if I were to say that to you, that that's not true. He didn't come out of nowhere. What he means is he didn't see him, right? But we know that the car did not actually appear out of nowhere. That's not a thing. And because we know that to be true, the only thing we have to be concerned about in our argument is premise 2, that the universe had a beginning, okay? That's the concern in this lesson, is that does the universe have a beginning? Because we know premise 1 to be true, we only need to worry about the evidence for premise 2. So if we can discover who started the universe, we may be able to understand why it started. If we can understand why it started, then we can better understand why we're here and what we're supposed to do with our resources and with our time and all of that. All right? So, am I on? Did my thing die? Okay. I have like multiple pointers, so I can make this work if my thing doesn't want to work. All right, so we're going to look at today what we're going to call the surge of the universe. Our lesson was called, In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge. All right, this acrostic stands for the 5 lines of scientific evidence leading to the conclusion that the universe did have a beginning. Okay, so we're going to move through these today, and they're not going to be exhaustive by any means, but we are going to move through them today. They help to disprove the idea that the universe has always existed up until I think it was 31. The scientific conclusion was the universe was static. In other words, it was always existing. And we're going to talk about what happened in 1931, but I think it was 1931, all of a sudden scientists started to realize what the Bible had taught from the beginning, that there was nothing and then there was something, that the universe came into being. All right, so let's look at these in our acrostic tonight. First, we have the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, again, we already defined some of these, so we'll move reasonably quickly through them. This states that the universe is running out of usable energy. With each passing moment, the energy that we have is being used like batteries in a flashlight, like gasoline in a tank in your car. We're running out. Now, we're not running out like tomorrow. No one needs to be concerned. But if the Lord tarries in a couple billion, trillion years, there won't be any more energy left in the universe. Okay? We'll have used it all up. The sun will burn out, right? It's all going to be gone. We are moving downward. Okay? We're moving downward. And so if the universe was eternal, all right, so if it was eternal, okay, and this is maybe, stop to think for a second, because this can be heavy initially. If the universe was eternal, okay, so there was no beginning, we would be out of energy by now. Okay? In other words, if you take the amount of energy that we have, right, and you go back, there at some point, like there was at some point a maximum amount of energy, because energy is not infinite, right? The first law of thermodynamics says that, right? There's a fixed amount of energy in the universe. So there's not an infinite amount of energy. Since there's not an infinite amount of energy, we would have already been out by now, okay? if that makes sense. We're gonna revisit this idea of like infinite. Infinite's hard for me to get. So this is why it's hard. It's like, because infinite is a theoretical thing. We don't see infinite in anything. There's not infinite at any point in our lives. There's not infinite. So infinite's hard for us to grasp. But if we were to go back, take that fixed amount of energy, at some point in the past, we would have already run out because there's an infinite amount. There's an infinite amount of days. And so we would have run out of energy by now. And again, the second law of thermodynamics is conclusive. We know it's true. The second law of thermodynamics also states that the universe is moving toward disorder rather than order. So entropy ensures that nature will eventually turn a building into a pile of bricks, but it's never going to turn a pile of bricks into a building. All right? It's never going to happen. Okay? It's never going to happen. You know what? And any child that drives by something can make that sees something can make this logical jump, right? That you don't take a pile of parts from a watch and say, this is a watch. Wait long enough and it will eventually assemble itself, right? It doesn't happen, right? A watch breaks down, it never fixes itself, okay? So left without outside intervention, the building will turn into bricks, but the bricks will never turn into a building, all right? The second law of thermodynamics says that at some point, since there is a fixed amount of energy and that energy is running down, there could not have been an infinite number of days before today. Okay? Secondly, the expanding universe. The expanding universe. In 1929, astronomer Edward Hubble, who's named the Hubble telescope after it, deduced that the other galaxies in the universe are moving away from us. So he's sitting there in a telescope and he's looking at the stars and he's like, man, everything seems to be moving away. And he did this with a couple of ways. He looked at redshift and light and some different things. Basically, the idea is if you were to take a balloon, all right, and you were to like draw dots on a balloon, obviously this is super simplified to what the galaxy is, but right, each one of those dots represents the galaxy. If you were to blow that balloon up, all of the dots that you drew on your balloon would move away from each other. And all moving away from each other, not just one moving away from another. Everything moving away from everything else. The universe is like that. All right? The Bible talks about this, that God stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Okay? This is in the Bible. All right? And now we didn't know that up until 1929 that that's what the Bible was talking about, but the Bible did talk about it. All right? So he deduced this. The ultimate expansion from this idea is that at some point in the past, right, if I have a balloon and I stretch it all the way out to here, if I were to deflate that, go in reverse, at some point there would be 1 point, right? It would all go back into one. The universe is the same way. If we were to look at the universe and we were to see that everything is expanding, if we were to take that just logically backward, it all came out from 1 point, okay? Now, astronomers call this the Big Bang, okay? That's what they call this. That term was coined by an atheist. Fred Hoyle was his name. It was coined by an atheist as a mockery. This is ridiculous, he said, that everything comes from a single point, that there's a creator, because this is what it concludes, right? Like logically, if there was nothing, before there was nothing, there was no thing, right? There was no thing. So who started the first thing, right? And which is what we're going to talk about. So the Big Bang was now it's been like latched onto by evolutionists and latched onto by astronomers and by scientism people. But the thing is we could argue that the Big Bang happened. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And he said, let there be light. And there was light. Now, I'm not arguing. We're going to talk about the age of the earth in a minute. I found out tonight that the kids are talking about the age of the earth. But anyways, so we're all learning together. But what this is saying is that if you were to take everything back, there was a point. Now, let's also follow this again logically. The ultimate extrapolation from this idea is that at some point in time, all matter in all of the universe came from a single point, but this point was not like a super dense BB of matter. That's not the way this works. You have to keep going smaller than that super dense BB to the point where there is infinitely nothing. Okay? So you have to keep following it down. A BB, we think, well, that'd be amazing if all the matter in the universe fit into a BB. Yeah, the problem is that BB, is too big. Got to keep going down, and got to keep going down until there is nothing left. It's not a super dense point of matter, but literally nothing. There was no space. There was no time. There was no matter. There was nothing. At some point in the past, because we watched the universe expand, we can deduce that the universe came from a single, infinitely small point, which again, infinites don't exist, which means there was nothing. Okay, there was zero. All right, next. Cosmic background radiation. On account of discovering the expanding universe, it seemed likely that the universe began in a great explosion. All right, Edward Hubble sees this. He says, all right. So as they begin to look into it, they say, well, logically, it must have come from a big explosion. Again, atheists said, well, the Big Bang, mockingly, as a derisive term, because they all believed that the universe was the same since infinity beforehand. And they thought, you Christian scientists, you guys who are trying to make an excuse for God, are making up all this stuff about the universe expanding. And you guys are making up all this stuff about everything being from one point. They didn't want to accept it. And so some scientists theorize that there should be some background heat, right? If it's an explosion, there was a lot of heat, we should still see some sort of heat from this. This background heat is called cosmic background radiation. Upon investigating this radiation, which they did find, I think, in the 60s, other scientists believe that there should be, I don't want to get there yet. I don't want to jump. I'm getting ahead of my notes. There's so much. All right, so in 1965, we see this heat, okay? Now, when Hubble finds out that the expanding universe exists, he knew Einstein. Einstein and him were friends. Einstein, when he created his second law of thermodynamics, which we're going to talk about in a minute, he actually thought the universe was static. He thought everything was the same. Everything was just, there was no beginning. It was an eternal universe. And he actually put in something, they call it the cosmological constant, which was basically like a fudge number. Like in his big giant equation, he was like, well, this equation only makes sense if the universe is expanding. We know that the universe is not expanding, therefore, I'm going to stick this number in that levels it all out. Okay, that's not science. Okay, that's not science, but that's what he did. And when Hubble found it, Einstein, they call it, Einstein said it was his greatest folly, was putting this in. Now again, Einstein was not agnostic, or was not a Christian. He was not theistic in any way. He was at best agnostic. But so then they say, okay, we're going to look for this cosmic background radiation. We're going to find these things, and they do. And it's it's exactly where it should be, assuming that the universe has expanded from where it was, okay, from where they say in the Big Bang. It's exactly what it should be. It's a couple degrees above absolute zero. So then we come to the next. They're called great galaxy seeds. I don't know if you guys have ever seen an explosion, but I've never seen an explosion in which things were created. All right? Again, if I were to take a giant pile of bricks and blow them up, I would not expect that the pyramid would be standing there at the end. That's a ridiculous thought. Well, it's a ridiculous thought to think that if everything blows up in the beginning at a single point and it radiates out from that point, that everything would just, that there would be points of matter, like the worlds, the stars, that would come together, right? They don't in a giant explosion, things in midair don't just suddenly suck together, right, to make planets, right? That's not a thing. And so, these things called great galaxy seeds, and you can look these up on NASA. I mean, it's there. I looked it up. I didn't really understand it, but I looked it up. So it is there. Hey, I'm going to be honest with you. They found that there were these slight variations in this cosmic background radiation, almost like ripples. And what happened was these ripples, basically, they pushed matter to a point, and then they died down, and it allowed things to settle in their place. In other words, let's think about it from an Earth's perspective, right? According to science, we blew up from a single point. Our matter from the Earth was launched out that center point was launched out, and it came to settle around our sun. Well, why didn't it keep pushing it out? Like, again, stuff in an explosion doesn't just stop. It keeps going, right? Especially if there's no friction or anything. Like, you know what I mean? Like in space, there's no friction because there's no air. So it's like, why did this happen? Well, what this found was that these ripples show that the beginning of the universe was an extremely precise event. So it's not something that happened by accident. It was extremely precise, like 1 within 100,000. In other words, if the gravitational pull was a little different, if the explosion was a little stronger, we would not have the cosmos. Stuff wouldn't have worked. Either it would have kept pushing it out infinitely forward, or it would have gone out, and then the amount of gravitational pull from all the matter that was too close to each other would have sucked it all back together. But the fact that it blew up and stayed out is significant. Again, have you ever seen an explosion that just stopped? No, of course not. It's because it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. In other words, this discovery means that it was not some chaotic, random explosion, but it seems to be a purposeful, controlled event. Now, we're up to basically about 1992, okay, in science. Okay, this is recent stuff within all of our lifetimes, all right, that these discoveries are being made. Discoveries regarding these things are being made all the time. I read about a discovery that was made when I was looking up that thing that I didn't understand. They made some other recent discovery about that completely fits within all of this. It doesn't disregard anything. It makes complete sense. And so, this discovery means that the talk of like evolution or anything like that does not dispense with a need for God. In other words, even if evolution is true, even if the Big Bang is true, that doesn't dispense with a need for God, because it's still so precise. It's still so particular that there's no way it happened by accident. George Smoot was an astronomer during the times of these findings. He was one of the guys that found it, and when he came out, I forget which, I think it was like Scientific Magazine he quoted, and he looked out, and they asked him, they said, what do you see about these great galaxy seeds when they discovered them? And he said, if you're religious, it's like looking at God. That's what he said. He said, because the precision of this, there's no way it happened by accident. Now, I'm not saying that he was religious, but what he said is he acknowledged that a religious person is going to look at this and see that God exists. And we come to the last one in our surge, the E. We're going to use this one because my pointer's acting up here. Einstein's theory of general relativity. In 1916, Einstein developed this theory. Again, he thought the universe was static, so he stuck this cosmological constant in there, just fudged the numbers. But when Edwin Hubble showed him the red-shifted light from the observatory telescope, he returned to his original equations, the ones that, and he said, you know what? Must be true then. Must be true then. In other words, the universe exploded into being out of nothing. That was the conclusion that Edward Hubble came to. Scientists call this the Big Bang, but theologians call this ex nihilo creation. In other words, creation out of nothing. Where's that in the Bible? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Before the beginning, there was no beginning. There was nothing. And the Bible has talked about this from this whole time. Right? It's been there from the beginning, from the time we've had Scripture. When Moses wrote it down, we've known, the Bible has taught that God created the world out of nothing. And if you read the Genesis account, it goes through and it talks about how there was nothing and God brought things into existence. God brought things into existence. You see, there is a religion in science. There is a religion in science. If all this is so clear, right? You might say, I didn't understand a whole lot of that, what you just said, Pastor Tom. You might say that. But it's very clear to us from the world around us that stuff that is not there does never make stuff that is there. Right? That's just not a thing. And we can all agree on that. If it's so obvious, why don't all atheists accept this instead of attempting to avoid facts with implications and wild and implausible explanations? Why? Robert Jastrow is an agnostic astronomer. And he said this: theologians are generally are delighted with the proof that the universe had a beginning. But for astronomers, they are curiously upset. Their reactions provide an interesting demonstration of the response of the scientific mind. Supposedly, a very objective mind with evidence uncovered by science itself, leading to a conflict with the articles of faith in our profession. Get that? Articles of faith in our profession, scientists. Okay? So whenever a scientist says that he doesn't have faith in anything, no, there are articles of faith in science. It turns out that scientists behave the way the rest of us do when our beliefs are in conflict with evidence. They react the same way. We become irritated, pretend the conflict does not exist, or we paper over it with meaningless phrases. Just make up stuff. He followed it up with this. This is a curiously emotional language for a discussion of some mathematical formulas. There's a lot of emotion going into this whole fact that scientists say that the universe had a beginning and that beginning couldn't have been God. All right, it's awfully emotional. I suppose the idea of the beginning in time annoyed Einstein because of its theological implications. Scientists know the theological implications of the world having a beginning. They understand this. It's nothing that is confusing to them. So here we have the Kalam cosmological argument. All right, here's your next point. So that was kind of the scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. The Kalam cosmological argument is a philosophical argument. It's not a scientific one. Okay? In other words, it's based on truth, it's based on logic and reason. And science is one of those reasons, right? But it's not a purely scientific argument. The first premise, and this is going to be very similar, okay? Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. All right? So premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause from its beginning. Something, all right, these are kind of like the reasonings behind it, the reasons behind this premise. Something cannot come from nothing. My wife began singing the song by Julie Andrews when I said this yesterday. All right? Nothing ever could, right? Nothing ever could. Something cannot come from nothing. If something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable. Why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing? Why aren't we seeing this on a regular basis? Right? If this could happen, we should be seeing it. Especially, there should be some record of it over the course of human history, at least once, right? Never. Not one time, because it can't happen. And to back up what we just talked about, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise one. So because of these three truths, we can say that premise one is correct. All right? Does that make sense to everybody? So whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The universe, as we just talked about, began to exist. So therefore, the universe has a beginning. The Kalam cosmological argument, come on, there it is. The Kalam cosmological argument is a philosophical argument that basically states that because there cannot be an infinite number of days before today, or today would have never gotten here, right? If there was an infinite number of days before today, then today would have never gotten here. In other words, let's take yesterday, for example, okay? There's an infinite number of days starting at yesterday. Where's the beginning of that first day? Well, infinitely that way. If you pick a day, well, there was an infinite number of days before that day. In other words, we could never get here to today if there was an infinite number of days on that end. We would never have gotten here. There would be an infinite number of days before we got to today. I know it's confusing, but this is the principle, okay? The reason that this matters is because it adds to the scientific evidence that's already collected. So scientific evidence has faults. Mostly scientists, okay? It has faults, and so philosophical evidence is helpful. If there are an infinite number of days, which means there would always be one more day that would have had to pass before today got here. All right? All right? I know it's hard to, but if you go all the way back, you can't, right? And there was always one more before today. But since today is here, the universe must have had a finite number of days. If it's finite, there was a beginning, okay? That's the logic. If it's finite, there was a beginning. All right, so is the universe young or old? This is the fun part, okay? So some Christians, they don't believe in the Big Bang, okay? Some people would redefine the Big Bang as maybe the first day of creation, because they think that it contradicts with the Bible. Now, there's a ton of information on this. If you are very, very interested in this topic, and you want a non-6-day creationist standard 6,000 year or 11,000 year or whatever you say, young earth creationist argument for it, I would recommend a book by a man named John Lennox. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World. It's phenomenal, or you can, better yet, you can look him up and have him just explain it on YouTube, okay? And then you don't have to read the book. But it's a very good, he talks about this, but this is, the age of the earth wasn't much of a controversy in the early church. Okay, this is a relatively new thing. The reason is the fact that God created the universe is more important than when. The age of the universe is an argument amongst Christians, not amongst atheists and Christians. It is a waste of my time to argue how old the universe is with a person who doesn't believe that either the universe had a beginning, because there are still people that would hold to an infinite universe, or that it began out of nothing. Like, why does it matter how old it is? If it began out of nothing, that's a way bigger issue than the age of the earth. We should, as Christians, be willing to concede the age while we discuss the existence of God, is what I'm saying. All right? In other words, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We might be wrong on this. And if you read that book, 7 Days That Divide the World, he would take the Genesis account and talk about it exactly the same way as we would, exactly literally, and come to a different conclusion, okay? He believes in a literal interpretation of Scripture and still says that the earth is old. Okay, now, again, I have heard the arguments. I stand by, I am a young earth creationist, okay? I think there's some major issues that they have to account for, and to be honest, there's major issues that we have to account for as young earth creationists. Why can I see stars that are 14 billion years old? I shouldn't be able to see them because the speed of light means that the universe needs to be 14 billion years old for me to see them. However, I would argue, and again, this is not really what this lesson is about, but I would argue that if God is creating everything out of nothing, the difficult part is not that he allows me to see the stars, okay? He made it out of nothing. But there's some issues that they have to argue with, that they would have to answer for, and there's some issues that we have to answer for. In both instances, in any instance when you're talking about the creation of the universe, the basis is faith. The basis is faith. Because it takes faith to believe that the universe always existed, because that doesn't make any sense, okay? And it takes a lot less faith to believe that there was a person who started everything going. In other words, Christians who disagree that God created, we may disagree on when the events occurred, the events of creation. But the foe is naturalism, not different stripes of supernaturalism, okay? In other words, an old earth creationist is just a different stripe of supernaturalist than us, okay? We don't often say that we're supernaturalists, but that's effectively what we are, okay? So, again, the point of this lesson is not to argue the age of the universe. There's lots of information. That's something you need to go study and determine for yourself what you believe. And remember that no one is going to stand before God in the end and have to answer the question of how old the earth is to get into heaven. It's not the point, okay? It's not the point. It's an argument or a discussion amongst believers in the Bible, not unbelievers and believers, okay? And never let an unbeliever bring it up to you in an argument about creation, because it's a moot point with an unbeliever because he doesn't believe that God exists. So just stick on that point, okay? Just stick on that point. All right, so, but who made God, right? Who made God? And other kind of various objections. Now, in this lesson, there was two big, kind of opposing points to the scientific evidence. I skipped it. One, I always go way over time more than I want to. And the other reason is because I can't explain it well enough. to do it justice. I don't understand it well enough, the opposing views. In my study, in the weeks that I've put into kind of understanding these arguments, I have mostly a grasp on what I believe, okay? I'm not too where other people believe yet. That's just the honest truth. So I skipped those. They are in the book if you take the book and you want to read those, but just to be transparent with everybody. So although this question, who made God, may sound convincing, right? If you say like, well, the universe had a beginning, their follow-up question is almost always going to be, well, then who made God? The problem is that this presupposes, this has an issue. The law of causality does not say that everything had a beginning. That's not what it says. Look in your notes. Your notes said everything that had a beginning has a cause, right? So in other words, we don't believe in a God that had a beginning. So our God didn't have a cause. But this presupposes, this question, who made God, presupposes that we believe in a God that had a beginning, which is not true, okay, which is not true. So they also like to bring up, atheists also like to bring up this idea of the God of the gaps. Okay, if you ever talk to an atheist, what they're saying anytime that you don't understand something about science, you just throw God in there and say God did it. All right, that's what they say. The problem is that's an argument from ignorance. What I'm saying is that when I don't know something and I say, well, then God must have done it, that's an argument from ignorance. But all the things that we talked about in today's lesson and much, much more evidence is not an argument from ignorance, it's an argument from knowledge. In other words, I am looking at the second law of thermodynamics, and I'm looking at the expanding universe, and I'm looking at cosmic background radiation, I'm looking at all these things, and I can presuppose from this basis of knowledge that God exists. So I'm not standing in ignorance. The God of the gaps is standing in ignorance and saying, well, I don't understand, so therefore it must be God. That's not where we are at all. Where we are is saying, hey, we're standing in a basis of knowledge and we are arguing fact. I read last night in this book, Tactics. I actually have a quote if I have time for it. This book, Tactics, it's a great book on talking to other people about what you believe in, if you ever want to know. But basically, the argument that he was making in what I read last night, and I didn't put it in my notes, so I'm going to go by memory because I read it after the notes were done, and I'm like, oh, this is so good, and it goes along. Actually, I'm only reading one thing, but there was like 1,000 things that were so, I'm like, what a jerk. What a jerk, adding it after my lesson was done. But basically what he said is, if we believe that blind faith was a virtue, then we would not be trying to find an argument to make Christianity true. In other words, if the virtue was that we believed without knowledge, we would not be wanting more knowledge. We would be wanting less knowledge because, like, take the resurrection, for example. If I say there's historical evidence for the resurrection, if faith is a virtue, in other words, blind faith is a virtue, then that means that if there was evidence that the resurrection didn't happen and I believed it anyway, that would be better. I'd have more faith, right? More blind faith is better. That's not Scripture. Paul said, specifically regarding the resurrection, he said that if you don't have evidence for the resurrection, then your faith is vain, right? If the resurrection didn't happen, then your faith is vain. And so faith is, just because without faith it's impossible to please God, they are not inversely correlated. In other words, the more faith I have, the less knowledge. Or the less faith I have, the more knowledge. Like, no. As I gain more knowledge, my faith does not go down. All right? And so that's not the case. So let's look quickly, very quickly, at these things about God. Since nature had a beginning, its cause must be supernatural. If time was created, then the cause of time must be outside of time. Is that logical? Right? If time was created, then the cause of that must be outside of time. In other words, it's timeless. Okay? It's timeless. Before the first day, before the day the universe was created, there was no time, because in the beginning hadn't happened yet. There was no beginning. If that's the case, then whoever started the beginning was timeless, or whatever, whoever or whatever. If space had a beginning, then the cause of space must be outside of space. He's spaceless. All right? It's hard for us to think about this, but before, in the beginning, there was no space for things to exist in. God created the space to put the stuff in, okay? So therefore, whoever existed that's made space cannot be made of space. The logic here follows as this. I cannot create myself. If I look at a building and I see that a building was built, I would say, well, there must have been an architect, a builder. And that architect can't be part of the building because he would have then had to have made himself because he's part of the building, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? My mother, right? The thing that created me was my mother. I am not part of my mother, right? My mother is separate from me. If I was part of my mother, then I would have created myself, and that doesn't make any sense, right? In other words, there's a paradox there. And so all of these principles are true because whatever is part of time can't have time as a boundary. He's got to be outside of it. Whatever made space, you can't make something you're part of, so he cannot exist in space. If matter had a beginning, then the cause of matter must not be made of matter. He must be immaterial. He must be immaterial. He's not made of stuff. So we have a timeless, spaceless, immaterial being. Next, he must be able to fashion our vast and complex universe, so he must be powerful. Right? He must be powerful. Psalm 65 says this, which by his strength setteth fast the mountains, being girded with power, which stilleth the noise of the sea and the noise of their waves and the tumult of the people. All right? That's what it says about God. Their strength. He must be able to design a precise universe. He must be intelligent. He must be intelligent. Psalm 19:1 says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Psalm 33:6 says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. The precision that the cosmos was made with intelligence. He must have the desire to create the universe of order and beauty and to fill it with life. So therefore, he must be personal. In other words, a law, gravity, let's say, the law of gravity, it does not ever defy itself. Right? Laws don't defy themselves. And so a thing that is operating outside, in other words, whatever was before the world began could not have been a thing like just a physical property or a law, because a law like gravity does not ever decide. It doesn't decide, right? It just does its thing. I hold something up and I let it go and it falls down, right? Gravity, I pick things up and put them down. That's what they do. That's what it does, right? But we have something that has a desire to create a universe of order and beauty. In other words, he changed direction. There was nothing, and then he created something. It changed. There was a change in the way that the universe worked because there was a universe, and there wasn't before, right? So we have here 6 things. We have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent, personal being. I don't know about you, that sounds a whole lot like God to me. Doesn't it? That sounds a whole lot like God. In closing, this guy, Ludwig Wittgenstein, I think is how you pronounce his name, said the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. Religion explains, okay? This is, again, the box top. The box top explains. The box top makes all these scientific things, all these principles, all these arguments make sense. Why? Because it's what exists there, all right? It's what exists there. And that's what matters, okay? Now, I'm not saying that I know everything. Matter of fact, I'm expressly saying I do not know everything. And I'm not saying that I got everything right in my arguments. I'm not saying that if I were to stand with an atheist and have a discussion with them, again, You could argue an old earth, a young earth. You can argue a lot of different things, but this lesson goes through the logical argument. It makes sense. It makes sense. What we've written down today makes sense. Read through this. It will help you. Understand this, as someone says. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be like, oh, well, according to the surge of the universe, these 5 principles. No. But when someone says, I don't believe that the universe had a creator, you say, do you know anything that came from nothing? And when they say, well, what do you mean? Be like, well, everything that you've ever experienced has come from something. So how can you make that conclusion? And we can go from there. So I hope that was helpful to you. Does anyone, be nice to me, have any questions? Anyone? Leah? So, there's going to be different discussions of this depending on who you ask. There's arguments that would say that when Genesis says that we're created in the image of God, that we are created with his ability to reason, with his ability to be creative. If you look at who God is in Genesis, right? Specifically when it says that, right? God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. I've heard all kinds of arguments that I don't think so. I think that it is. I think that it is talking about who God is as a person, if that makes sense. Again, this is my interpretation of that text. People way smarter than me probably disagree with me. I'm sure they disagree with me. But what I would say is if you look at that text, so you look at well, God there created. We create, why? Because we're made in the image of God and he created, right? We reason, why? Well, because God said, come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord, right? He's a reasonable God. He uses logic. And so we have many of the attributes of God, but not the immutable attributes, right? We don't have timelessness. We don't have, omnipotence. We don't have those. There's many of the aspects of God that we do not have, but there's many of the aspects of God and the attributes of God that we do have, right? We can be loving, right? We can be, I believe God made us in his image. In other words, we reflect who he is, but we don't reflect who he is, mankind reflects who he is in innocence. Again, also, God made us in his image, and then we ruined it. Okay, so that's part of it too. And we will, I believe, show the image of God in eternity future. In other words, if someone were to look at us, we would be reflecting God's image. In other words, we have some of his attributes, many of his attributes, but there are still attributes that are unique to God himself that we don't have. Do I completely understand that? No, absolutely not. But I think I believe that's what Genesis is talking about when it says that we're made in his image, meaning we bear many of his attributes. And I would say there are things that God expresses that we can say, well, these are from him. These are things that we reflect off of God almost. That makes sense in any form. Okay. Any other questions? Neva? Sure.
But if he did, we're only seeing the light that was created in the explosion of those stars that are supposedly 15 billion years old. We're seeing the light because the light was already here. Mm-hmm. It didn't have to come 14 billion years.
Sure. And that's what I would say as well. If I were to argue a young earth, I would say, like I said, there is no difficulty in God putting photons in place after he just created the universe. That's not the difficult part. It's if God could just take the earth, for example. Is the difficult part if God made Adam from the dirt that he made him as an adult? No, I'm pretty sure the fact that he put dirt together and breathed life into it is the hard part, right? Yes, and exactly. And like I said, there are some major things that they probably have answers for, but I've not heard ones that are sufficient for me. Not yet. And a lot of them revolve around the flood. Okay, like that big issues with the flood. But that's not to say that they're wrong. I really don't know. I really don't know. Like I said, it's something that we have to study for ourselves. So, but Steve?
My experience, when there's an explosion, there's always evidence left over, whether it be 4 inch or be a
Yes.
foot long. And, it's like the explosion has to start from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe God caused an explosion. I just believe what the Word of God says.
Sure. But like I said, the argument is that, and we're going to talk about this next week a little bit, is that even if that is what you believe, that does not negate the existence of God. It only reinforces the existence of God. We're going to talk about evolution next week. And even if the earth is billions of years old, that doesn't mean that life walked out of a pond. That doesn't make any sense. And we've never seen that before, and we're never going to see that because it doesn't make any sense. All right, so in other words, even in that situation, which again, this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, something supernatural reached in to do something, to make it happen. Do we have another question? Did I see it? Gregory Koukl, Koukl. This book has been phenomenal. I will read this book every year. I just put it on my list of I will read this every year because it's something that I cannot grasp in one sitting, and I want to get better at it. So, all right. Any questions? Anything else? All right, if you think of anything, let me know, and that will give me more time to think about it than what I have right now, which would be great. All right, let's close in prayer. Dear God, we come before you, and Lord, we're in awe of how awesome a universe you have made. And Lord, as David said, when I consider the heavens, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And thank you so much that you are mindful. Thank you, Lord, for Jesus Christ and for his sacrifice for us on Calvary. Help us always to stand in awe of that as your greatest thing that you've ever done. And Lord, we love you, and we thank you, Lord, for giving us reason, giving us science, giving us the ability to learn and to study. And Lord, one day I look forward to the opportunity in heaven to learn and to study for all eternity. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.